Admiral Hart was a year older than Admiral King and had served 44 years in the Navy. In the autumn of 1940, he transferred most of his small fleet from China to Manila Bay. The Asiatic fleet in the existing war plan was responsible for the naval defense of the Philippines. It must support the army there so long as that defense continues. Its total strength when war broke was a heavy cruiser Houston, 2 light cruisers, 13 World War I destroyers, 28 submarines, and a number of auxiliaries. Obviously, all that this fleet could do in the event of a Japanese invasion of the Philippines was to retire or fight a delaying action. Tommy Hart, a real fighter, preferred the second alternative, but on 20 November the Navy Department ordered him to fall back. The Admiral then began deployment southward of all except his submarines, which were wanted to repel invasion, and Seaplane Wing 10 of PBYs, which were wanted for reconnaissance. On 8 December, 4 destroyers, 6 river gunboats, 5 bird-class minesweepers, 2 fleet oilers, floating dry dock, Dewey and a couple of tugs were still in Manila Bay. The 4th Marine Regiment was also in barracks at Cavite. Admiral Hart tried his best to remove Marines of the China Embassy Guard in time, and did get most of them out in river gunboat wake. But merchant ship President Harrison, sent for the rest, was captured by the Japanese on 8 December. Both commanders in the Philippines took the 27 November war warning very seriously and expected the blow to come soon. Ocean search by the PBYs was stepped up, and General MacArthur ordered all flying fortresses around Manila to be flown to Davao Field, Mindanao, for safety from a surprise air attack. But by 7 December only about half of them had gone, because room had to be left at the small Mindanao base for more B-17s expected presently from Hawaii. Nevertheless, the new war plan called for a counterattack on the Formosan airfields as soon as Japan made war or declared war. News of the Pearl Harbor attack reached Admiral Hart's headquarters in Manila at 2:30 a.m. December 8, East Longitude date, which was 8 a.m. December 7, Hawaiian time. There was nothing he could do but alert the Asiatic fleet to prepare for air attack. General MacArthur got the word about an hour later, and official confirmation arrived from Washington at 5:30 a.m. At dawn, a flight of 22 planes from Japanese carrier Ryujo attacked United States seaplane tender William B. Preston in Davao Gulf, Mindanao. That overt act inaugurated war in the Philippines. At 9:30 a.m., 2 flights of bombers from Formosa struck Baguio and the Tuguegarao airfield in northern Luzon. So there was no possible doubt that we were at war with Japan, or that the Philippines were on her list for conquest. Yet, in the face of this, there was hesitation at Manila about unleashing the B-17s against Formosa, or the fighter planes to intercept a bomber strike from Formosa that might reasonably be expected at any moment. General Sutherland, General MacArthur's Chief of Staff, and General Brereton, commanding MacArthur's Army Air Forces, have given each other the lie as to why the planned attack on Formosa was not promptly executed. Each claims that he wanted to do it, but that the other dragged his feet, or his wings, insisting that first there be a photographic reconnaissance of the Formosa airfields, and why had that not been done earlier? The surprise at Manila has never been thoroughly investigated, and Dr. Louis Morton, the official army historian, failed to get to the bottom of it. This naval historian can only venture a guess that the real trouble was bad blood between Sutherland and Brereton, of which, unfortunately, General MacArthur seems to have been ignorant. Whatever the cause, by 11:30 a.m. almost all B-17s and fighter planes were grounded on Clark, Nichols, Iba, and other fields of the aerodrome complex around Manila. The ground crews then began arming the bombers for a raid on Formosa, which had finally been ordered to take place that afternoon, and the pilots went to lunch. A force of 108 twin-engine Japanese bombers, escorted by 34 fighters, was then well on its way from Formosa to Manila. At about 11:30 a.m., warnings of this approaching strike, from observers in northern Luzon, began to reach the Air Force plotting board at Nielsen Field. Thence, about a quarter of an hour later, a warning message was ordered sent to Clark and other fields by teletype. Some claim that it never did go out, that the radio operator was at lunch. Nevertheless, one pursuit squadron of American fighter planes took off promptly from Iba Field, and another was just about to take off from Clark. At 12:15 p.m., when the first group of 27 Japanese bombers appeared, Their delighted pilots found the B-17s all lined up like sitting ducks, dropped their bombs from about 22,000 feet altitude, and were off and away. Then came a similar formation which bombed for 15 minutes, completely unmolested by American anti-aircraft, whose ancient ammunition, vintage 1932, and corroded bomb fuses could not reach so high. Finally came a full hour's strafing attack by 34 fighter planes. The scene was one of horror and destruction, relieved by many acts of individual heroism similar to those of the victims at Pearl Harbor. Iberfield was struck by 54 Japanese planes, just as the pursuit squadron, which had gone forth a little before noon, was about to land. That squadron gave a good account of itself, but lost all but 2 of its planes. Total losses to our side were 18 of the 35 B-17s present, destroyed, 56 fighter planes, 25 miscellaneous aircraft, and many installations destroyed, 8 men killed and 150 wounded at a cost to the enemy of only 7 fighters. After 1 day of war, and despite ample warning, the Far Eastern Air Force as an effective combat unit had been eliminated. After this debacle, there was no possibility of a counterattack, and Japan retained the initiative she had so easily won. December 9 was comparatively quiet, but the 10th was Navy Day for the enemy, who sent part of an 80-bomber and 52-fighter group to rub out the Cavite Navy Yard. While a substantial segment of this attack group neutralized airfields, some 54 bombers flew back and forth over Cavite at 20,000 feet elevation, beyond the range of our 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, bombing at will. The Navy Yard and a large part of the city of Cavite were completely destroyed, as were a dockside submarine, a minesweeper, and the entire reserve stock of submarines' torpedoes. On 12 December, all the PBYs of Patwing 10, returning from a fruitless search for an enemy carrier force that wasn't there, were destroyed by Japanese Zero fighters at their Olongapo moorings. The surviving aviators were sent south. The United States Navy had completely lost control of the waters and air surrounding Luzon. No supplies or reinforcements could reach MacArthur's army ever. Let us humbly remember this humiliating fact, and not bury it under the memory of MacArthur's gallantry, or the Navy's part in spearheading his return to the Philippines. Across the South China Sea, the Royal Netherlands Navy and the Royal British were faring no better. Japan actually began hostilities in that quarter 2 days before her strike on Pearl Harbor. Minelayer Tatsumiya Maru, beginning on the evening of 6 December, east longitude date, laid 456 mines in British territorial waters between Tumen Island and the Malay Peninsula, not far from Singapore. This was done to protect the forthcoming Japanese landings on that peninsula from interference by British ships in Singapore. Netherlands submarine O-16 and probably K-17 too were sunk in this minefield in mid-December. Worse things had already happened. Japanese bombers based on Indochina sank His Majesty battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse on 10 December. By that time, Japanese forces had already landed on the Malay Peninsula, taken Hong Kong from the British and Guam from us. Nor is this all that happened on the 10th, which should be regarded as an even greater day of infamy than the 7th at Pearl Harbor. On that day, the Japanese executed the first of their 5 amphibious landings on Luzon at Apari. The others coming up were at Vigan and Legazpi, 11th and 12th, Lingayen, 21st, and Layman Bay, 24th. The pitifully few ships and aircraft of Admiral Hart's fleet were unable to prevent the enemy from landing whenever and wherever he chose, or even to delay his timetable of conquest. Not that Asiatic fleet failed to try. Its submarines were deployed to intercept the landings, and sank a couple of transports or freighters. But that did not stop the Japanese. Our efforts only served to prove that a properly equipped amphibious force cannot be stopped by submarines alone, and a Japanese amphibious group led by Rear Admiral Tanaka in light cruiser Jintsu, of whom and of which we shall hear much more, landed at Davao, Mindanao on 20 December, and then proceeded to take Jolo. Japanese air forces so completely controlled the air over Manila Bay that reinforcements could not be brought in by sea, and the B-17s fleeted up from Mindanao were soon expended. On 21 December, Rear Admiral Francis W. Rockwell, Commandant 16th Naval District, established new headquarters in a tunnel on the Rock, Corregidor. On Christmas Eve, General MacArthur decided to evacuate Manila, daily being bombed, and to deploy his army in the ultimate defence area, the Bataan Peninsula. Admiral Hart at the same time ordered the only 2 destroyers left in Manila Bay to Java, where Rear Admiral William A. Glassford, in cruiser Marblehead, was rallying the Asiatic fleet. Hart himself departed for Java in submarine Shark the day after Christmas, leaving tender Canopus and a handful of minecraft, gunboats and motor torpedo boats under Admiral Rockwell to be expended. That they were covering the flanks of the army in its stubborn defence of Bataan. There was no lack of individual bravery. A colourful character, Commander Francis J. Bridget of an already expended PBY squadron, organised a weird naval battalion of about 200 men from grounded aviators, Marines, Filipinos, or anyone who would join. Wearing white Navy uniforms dyed bright yellow, these tough hombres not only protected General MacArthur's headquarters at Mariveles from capture by one Japanese landing force several times their strength, but forced a second Japanese group to hole up in caves on the coastal cliff, whence they were disinfected by Lieutenant John D. Bulkeley's PT boats. It was no use. On 21 February 1942, submarine Swordfish took President Quezon of the Philippine Commonwealth out of danger, and on 11 March, on orders from Washington, Lieutenant Bulkeley's PT carried General MacArthur and Admiral Rockwell to Mindanao, whence B-17s flew them to Australia. General Jonathan M. Wainwright, left in command of the army, evacuated Bataan on 8 April to Corregidor. The Rock, gallantly defended by Colonel S. L. Howard's 4th Marines and the remnants of the army, held out for another month. Finally, on 6 May came the bitterest event of all, when General Wainwright, hoping to prevent further effusion of blood, surrendered Corregidor and all armed forces in the Philippines to the enemy. This was the greatest surrender in American history, not excepting Appomattox. But unlike that one, in which the southern dream of empire faded, Corregidor inspired a grim determination on the part of General MacArthur to return, and of the country to see that he did return, in sufficient force to reverse the verdict. A new bond of brotherhood between Americans and Filipinos was forged, and it has never since been sundered. By the new year, Japan could afford to neglect the Philippines, since both United States and Commonwealth forces there were completely neutralized, and to the southward Japan was fast realizing her bold scheme of conquest. England, the Netherlands, and America had to fight for the Malay Barrier, a name then applied to the string of big islands from the Malay Peninsula to New Guinea, most of them belonging to the Netherlands East Indies. If Japan got possession of these rich territories, teeming with oil, rubber, and other strategic materials, she would be well-nigh self-sufficient. And once in control of the Molucca, Sunda, Lombok, and other straits between the islands, the warriors of Nippon might pour into the Indian Ocean and threaten British India and Australia. In April 1941, an attempt was made to arrive at an international staff agreement about the conduct of war in the Far East, similar to the Anglo-American one at Washington. Representatives of the United States, Great Britain, the Netherlands, Australia, and New Zealand met at Singapore. This conference came to no useful result, largely because of divergent views about Singapore itself. The British had spent vast sums on creating the military and naval base there, and regarded it as a symbol of empire, a pledge to the Antipodes that England in her time of greatest peril had not forgotten them. Rear Admiral Turner and other Americans took a dim view of Singapore as a strategic base. Owing to its lack of defences on the land side, they predicted that Singapore could not long hold out in the event of war with Japan, nor did it. Even after His Majesty's ship Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sunk, the British continued to insist that Singapore must and could be defended. Divergent aims bedevilled the new American-British-Dutch-Australia Combined Command, set up on 15 January 1942, throughout the 6 stormy weeks of its existence. The British wanted more troops to be poured into Singapore and to use the combined naval forces to escort them. The Dutch wished to protect their East Indies, the Australians to prevent an invasion of their country, and the Americans to prepare a comeback. Thus, American, British, Dutch Australia as a combined command was very creaky at the joints. Communication and language difficulties were never solved. No combined system of signalling was worked out. The native Indonesians, unlike the Filipinos, were apathetic or hostile. The Supreme American British Dutch Australia commander, Field Marshal Sir Archibald Wavell, had proved himself in Africa to be one of England's most distinguished soldiers. But here he failed, as anyone under like conditions would have failed. Under WWII, Admiral Hart commanded the combined naval forces, a Dutch Lieutenant General the ground forces, and a British Air Chief Marshal the air forces. The Asiatic Fleet was now based at Surabaya on the north coast of Java, and its principal units were organised into the American-British-Dutch-Australia striking force under Vice Admiral Helfrich of the Royal Netherlands Navy. Port Darwin, Australia, 1,200 miles distant, was the nearest service and supply base for the United States Asiatic Fleet. Two powerful Japanese attack groups, the eastern under Vice Admiral Takahashi and the western under Vice Admiral Ozawa, composed of heavy cruisers and destroyers escorting army transports, and with Admiral Nagumo's still intact carriers of the Pearl Harbor striking force in wide-ranging support, slithered into the Netherlands East Indies, like the arms of two giant octopi. The western octopus worked down the South China Sea to North Borneo and Sumatra, the eastern to East Borneo, the Celebes, Ambon, Timor and Bali. Aircraft would pound down a beachhead. Amphibious forces would then move in and activate another airfield and soften up the next objective for invasion. Nothing possessed by the three Allied powers could stop this grim process. Dutch and United States submarines inflicted considerable damage, but the enemy forces were overwhelming. The Allies, owing to their diverse interests, dissipated their forces in various directions and on gallant but futile missions. Commander Paul Talbot in John D. Ford, with 3 other World War I destroyers, broke into the Japanese force landing at Balikpapan, Borneo, on the night of 23 to 24 January 1942. And he sank 4 Maras and a patrol craft, but this did not delay the Japanese timetable by even a day. By 3 February, Japanese airplanes, now established at Kondari in the Celebes, began raiding Surabaya, forcing Admiral Hart to send his tenders south to Cilacap. None too soon, for light cruiser Marblehead was so badly mauled off Bangka next day that she had to be sent home. Another air-surface battle between planes from carrier Ryujo and an American-British-Dutch-Australia striking force under Admiral Dorman on 15 February forced the ships to retire through Gaspar Strait to the Java Sea, and on that very day Singapore surrendered, as bitter a draught for Britain as Pearl Harbor had been for America. Now, in quick succession, the Japanese occupied Timor and Nagumo's carrier planes bombed Port Darwin, heavily damaging the Allied supply ships and forcing the abandonment of that port as a supply base. The octopi would soon put the final squeeze on Java. By the time they were ready for that, American-British-Dutch-Australia Command had been reorganized upon the floor, like the person described in T.S. Eliot Sweeney Among the Nightingales. Admiral Hart had been a good skipper in a bad storm, using the little that he had to fight to best advantage, but on 12 February, owing to the Netherlands government's desire that in their East Indies a Dutch admiral should be in command, Tommy Hart was relieved by Admiral Helfrich. This change did not help the desperately bad situation. All fighting ships and sailors had been worked beyond their capacity. Facilities for repairs were inadequate at Surabaya and almost non-existent at Cilacap on the south coast of Java, which most of the Asiatic Fleet now had to use as base, owing to frequent air attacks on the north coast ports. Field Marshal Wavell was ordered home and on 25 February departed. General Brereton of the United States Army Air Force had already gone, together with most of the planes that he had managed to evacuate from the Philippines. Units of the British, of United States, and of the Netherlands Navy remained. American-British-Dutch-Australia no longer existed, in fact, only in theory. Dutch officers were now in full control of all armed forces left in the area. Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman now commanded the striking force of the 3 Allied navies, based at Surabaya. It was far from negligible as a fighting array. Heavy cruisers Houston and His Majesty's ship Exeter, light cruisers His Majesty's Australian ship Perth, His Majesty's Netherlands ship De Ruyter and Java, 4 American, 3 British and 3 Dutch destroyers. Collectively, these ships were not strong enough to stop the major Japanese thrust, and they had never worked together as a team. Iwo massive amphibious forces were approaching, 56 transport types under Rear Admiral Ozawa to the westward, and 41 under Rear Admiral Nishimura to the eastward. and the eastern one, which Dorman hoped to intercept since it seemed headed for Surabaya, was covered by a formidable support force under Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, which included heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro, and 2 destroyer squadrons with light cruiser flagships, Naka and Jintsu, under Rear Admirals Nishimura and Tanaka. Vice Admiral Nagumo's Pearl Harbor striking force was hovering in the Indian Ocean to prevent reinforcement from that quarter and took no part in the battle. The air component was supplied by the Japanese cruisers' float planes. Their spotting and after dark illuminating may well have tipped the scales, for Dorman had no aircraft whatsoever. He had left his float planes ashore on the 26th, expecting a night battle, and when he called for air support from Java, the air commander there stupidly sent his few light bombers and fighters to make a fruitless attack on the Japanese transports. Admiral Dorman, a fine type of fighting sailor, was about to enter Surabaya for rest and replenishment when he received reports of 2 Japanese convoys, the nearer but 8 miles distant. At 3:25 p.m. February 27, striking force reversed course to give battle in waters between the north coast of Java and WWII Island, which the Japanese had already taken. Dorman had no time to issue a battle plan, much less to distribute it, and there was confusion and delay from the necessity of translating every signal. About the only command that Dorman could get across during the battle was "Follow me," and every ship that could, did. His object was simple enough: to beat off or get around Takagi's fighting ships and raise havoc among the transports waiting just over the northern horizon. Takagi's object, naturally, was to prevent this and clear the way for the invasion of Java. The battle was such a series of thrusts and parries, bursts of gunfire and shoals of torpedoes over a period of 5 or 6 hours that it is difficult to follow. The Allied order of battle: 3 British destroyers, Encounter, Electra, Jupiter in the van. Her Netherlands, Majesty's ship, De Ruyter. Dorman's ship, followed by His Majesty's ship Exeter, USS Houston. His Majesty's Australian ship Perth. Her Netherlands, Majesty's ship Java in column. 2 Dutch destroyers, Witte de With and Courtenaire on the left flank, and 4 Americans, John D. Edwards, Alden, John D. Ford, Paul Jones in the rear. It was a calm, clear day with high visibility and a slight swell. At 4:12 p.m. the enemy was sighted, in 3 columns, Tanaka's Jintsu and 7 destroyers on the right flank, Takagi's 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Haguro in the centre, Nishimura's Naka and 6 destroyers on the left flank. At 4:16 a.m. firing commenced between the 2 heavy groups at the extreme range of 28,000 yards, almost 14 miles. Tanaka's destroyer squadron closed Electra and Jupiter to 18,000 yards and straddled them, but they could not reach him with their 4.7-inch guns. As Dorman's course, if continued, would enable the Japanese to emulate Admiral Togo's famous Tsushima crossing of the T, the Netherlands admiral changed course from northwest to west to parallel the enemy, and endeavoured to close range so that his 3 light cruisers could use their 6-inch guns. In the gunfire duel that ensued, the Japanese, with planes spotting for them, had the advantage, and at 4:31 p.m. made the first hit, fortunately a dud, on De Ruyter. Takagi now ordered the first torpedo attack, and he had 18 ships to launch from, as all Japanese cruisers carried torpedoes. Over a period of 19 minutes, 4:33 p.m. to 4:52 p.m., the Japanese launched 43 of their fast, powerful long lances, but made not one hit. The range was too great. Both forces sped westward at about 25 knots or more, firing furiously but not hitting. This battle showed something that became increasingly evident during World War II, the ineffectiveness of naval gunfire at high speed and great range. Again, the Japanese took the initiative. At 5 p.m., bold Tanaka peeled off to cross Dorman's bows and make a second torpedo attack. He would have had little chance to score against the thin frontal silhouette of Dorman's column, but for a cruiser's 8-inch hit at 5:08 p.m. on His Majesty's ship Exeter, which put 6 of her 8 boilers out, slowed her down and caused her to sheer out of line, about 90 degrees to port. Houston, Perth and Java, assuming that Dorman, whom they could not see in the smoke, must have ordered a 90-degree left turn, followed suit, and so flagship De Ruyter, after continuing west for a minute or 2, had to do the same. As a result, the Allied force became scattered in a confused pattern right slap into Tanaka's torpedo water. He could hardly fail to score, and he did. At 5:15 p.m. Her Netherlands Majesty's ship Courtenay exploded, jackknifed and sank. Takagi, seeing his chance with the Allied force in confusion, and slowed down to 15 knots by Exeter's mishap, ordered his entire force in for the kill. Dorman sent the 3 British destroyers to counter-attack through smoke to the northwestward, where Tanaka's squadron was milling about and trying pot shots. By this time, in the gathering dusk, the entire battle area was shrouded in smoke, through which only an occasional blinker signal from Admiral Dorman reached his ships. Electra, which received this latest order at 5:25 p.m., scored a hit on Jintsu, but in return was stopped dead by a shell exploding in a boiler room. Tanaka now drove in to try and finish off limping Exeter, but was frustrated by the nimble footwork of destroyers Jupiter, WWII and Encounter. The enemy then doubled back to gang up on Electra. She fulfilled the tragic implication of her name at 6 p.m. Dorman, in the meantime, had ordered Exeter, escorted by WWII, to Surabaya, and reformed his column in this order. De Ruyter, Perth, Houston, Java, with the 4 United States destroyers flank and rear. The cruisers now engaged in another long-range gunfire duel, in which Houston took 2 duds. As Dorman was steering south, Takagi assumed that he was retreating, advised the convoy, which had turned north, to resume course for the landing beaches, and sent Nishimura's squadron to finish off the Allies. Nishimura scored not one hit with the 24 torpedoes his squadron launched. Dorman now ordered the United States destroyers to cover his retirement. Their squadron commander, T.H. Binford, regarding attack as the best means to cover, turned north to torpedo Nachi and Haguro. Unfortunately, the American torpedoes had been set so that they could only be fired broadside, and under these circumstances to close to a proper range would mean almost certain destruction by the cruiser's gunfire before launching. Binford therefore took a chance shot at 10,000 yards, and all torpedoes missed. After a short gunfire duel with destroyer Asagumo, possibly holing her, the 4 Pipers hastened to catch up with Admiral Dorman. That great sea dog never acknowledged defeat. At 6:30 p.m. he had radioed to Admiral Helfrich ashore. "Enemy retreating west. Where's the convoy?" At that very moment, Takagi ordered the convoy to reverse course and stand northward. It was then only 30 miles away. The Japanese did not underestimate the ability of Dorman, now steering northwesterly, to get at the convoy, and if the Allies had had any air reconnaissance, they might have evaded Takagi's ships and struck a fatal blow. But the dice were loaded against them. At about 1927, the converging cruisers sighted each other again in the gathering darkness. Nachi led Haguro, Jintsu, and several destroyers. 13,000 yards to the southeastward was De Ruyter, followed by Perth, Houston, Java, and 4 American destroyers. His Majesty's ship Jupiter was stationed about a mile on De Ruyter's port bow. Perth and Houston opened fire at 1933, but their shells fell short. The enemy fired star shells to illuminate, and at 1936, when Captain Waller, Rann of Perth, saw a row of flashes in the enemy column, he rightly suspected that they meant torpedo launchings and swung hard right to course 60°. The other ships followed suit, and this, the 4th Japanese torpedo attack, was successfully evaded. Dorman now planned to escape these troublesome ships and get at the convoy by following the coast of Java west. So, at 1955, he swung his column south and at flank speed steamed toward the Java coast, which soon loomed up in the moonlight. There could be no escape, since he was continually illuminated by Japanese float planes dropping flares. When his column reached Shoalwater, at 9 p.m., Admiral Dorman turned right to parallel the coast. The United States destroyers at this point left the formation and turned east for Surabaya. Dorman had instructed them to do that when their torpedoes were expended, as now they were. As Dorman's force continued westward along the coast, it skirted a newly laid Dutch minefield whose exact position had been broadcast at frequent intervals. At high speed, the cruisers, followed by 2 destroyers, cleared the mined area safely, but at 9:25 p.m. an explosion racked His Majesty's ship Jupiter, and she dropped out, victim either of a floating mine that had broken loose or of an internal explosion. She sank 4 hours later. Shortly after Jupiter exploded, Admiral Dorman turned his 4 cruisers north again. Although he now had but 1 destroyer with him and no air support, this brave officer determined to make one last desperate thrust to thwart the invasion of Java. It was a self-terminatory move. Zigzagging slightly, the column steamed northward, hoping to avoid further attention from the enemy. Over an hour passed and nothing happened, except that destroyer encounter dropped out to pick up survivors from Courtenaire on life rafts. Then Nachi, Haguro and several destroyers were sighted in bright moonlight on the port beam, steering south. Takagi reversed course to parallel Dorman, and the 2 columns exchanged long-range gunfire for 20 minutes, hoping for a lucky hit. Salvos came slowly now, since both sides were low on ammunition and their crews were near exhaustion. At 11:20 p.m., when the 2 columns were almost parallel, 8,000 yards apart, the Japanese cruisers launched 12 torpedoes. De Ruyter and Java, caught in the wide spread, burst into flames, exploded and stopped dead. Java lived for only 15 minutes. De Ruyter defiantly floated for about 3 hours. Their captains and Admiral Dorman followed the hard ritual of the sea and went down with them. Before he lost contact with Perth and Houston, Dorman had ordered them not to stand by him, but to retire to Batavia. They headed for Tanjong Priok, where they signalled to Admiral Helfrich the tragic results of the Battle of the Java Sea. In one afternoon and evening, half the ships of Admiral Dorman's striking force had been destroyed. The Japanese had not lost a single ship, and only 1 destroyer was damaged. The convoy was never touched. The main factors in this battle, any one of which would have doomed the Allies to defeat, were complete lack of air power, bad communications, and the enemy's superiority in torpedoes. The most surprising thing about the battle was its duration. Before World War II, most strategists thought that gun and torpedo fire had been developed to such a degree that naval battles would be decided in a few minutes, at the end of which one side would either be annihilated or so crippled that it could fight no more. Several battles in this war, notably Savo Island, were of that description. But in the Battle of the Java Sea, the 2 opponents slugged each other intermittently over a period of some 7 hours before one had to break off and admit defeat. That it lasted so long was due to Admiral Dorman's stubborn determination and the admirable manner in which men of the 3 navies under his command fought until they could fight no more. Java Sea was indeed a decisive battle. There was nothing now to stop the Japanese invasion. And when brave Dorman went down, his country's colonial empire was doomed. Even the eventual Allied victory could not eradicate the effects of this Japanese triumph. Never again would the Netherlanders rule over these beautiful islands and their volatile people. One Allied disaster after another followed the Java Sea battle. Seaplane tender Langley, pioneer carrier of the United States Navy, was sunk by air bombing south of Cilacap on 27 February while trying to bring in plane reinforcements. On the last night of February, USS Houston and His Majesty's Australian ship Perth, survivors of the Java Sea, gallantly charged into Banton Bay, adjoining Sunda Strait, to break up one of the major Japanese amphibious forces that was being landed. If only Dorman and his other ships had been with them, they could have realized the American-British-Dutch-Australia dream of breaking up a Japanese invasion force at its most vulnerable moment. But alas, it was so late, they were so few, and Admiral Kurita's Western Covering Group, built around 4 heavy cruisers, was too strong. Destroyer Fubuki almost caught Houston and Perth as they entered Banton Bay. She fired torpedoes at them at a range of about 2,700 yards, missed them, but hit and sank a couple of Japanese transports on their port hand. The cruisers swung around the bay, shooting up transports as they passed. One was sunk outright, and 3 others had to be beached. As they roared through the narrow channel between Panjang Island and St. Nicholas Point, the 2 cruisers ran into a fatal trap. On the port hand, a Japanese destroyer squadron blocked Sunda Strait, their escape hatch. On the starboard hand, freshly replenished, oversize heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma opened up on the 2 depleted, exhausted treaty cruisers. The Japanese shooting from almost point-blank range was inaccurate, but so overwhelming that only a miracle could have changed the result. His Majesty's Australian ship Perth came under fire at 11:26 p.m. At 12:05 a.m. March 1, she took a torpedo in her forward engine room that almost lifted her out of the water, then another, and in a few moments she went down, taking Captain Waller and hundreds more. Now every Japanese ship concentrated on putting Houston away. She was already listing dangerously to starboard. Around 12:10 a.m. she took a salvo in her after-engine room, which burst all the steam lines and scalded to death the entire engine room force. A torpedo hit forward smashed up main battery plot, whose crew was wiped out by a shell burst as they ran topside. Turrets went to local control, and for a few moments the gunners profited by a mistake that the enemy made. Illuminating his own ships, they hit 3 different destroyers and sank a minesweeper. A shell hit No. 2 turret just as powder bags were being loaded, starting a fire which forced Captain Rooks to have both magazines flooded. Now the 2 8-inch turrets had no ammunition except what was already in the hoists. 3 torpedoes hit the ship on her starboard side, and shrapnel from small-caliber fire ricocheted about her superstructure. Around 12:25 a.m., standing near a machine-gun mount, Rooks and the gun crew were killed by a bursting shell. Men stood by the other guns and fired every bit of ammunition until all was expended. Then, as the ship lost headway, Japanese destroyers swarmed about her, machine-gunning the quarterdeck and the port hangar where many of the survivors from below had congregated. Commander David Roberts, the executive, ordered abandon ship, and Seaman Stafford, standing on the careening fantail, sounded the call on his bugle at 12:33 a.m. Within 10 or 12 minutes, Houston rolled over and sank. Swimming survivors could see her ensign defiantly flying until it dipped below the waters of Sunda Strait. On this same bloody 1st of March, His Majesty's ship Exeter tried to lead USS destroyer Pope and His Majesty's ship Encounter through the Surabaya minefields to safety. All 3 were sunk by enemy naval gunfire and carrier bombing planes. Japanese troops swarmed over Java, and on the 9th the Dutch commanding general surrendered the Netherlands East Indies. Admiral Nagumo's carrier force was now free to raid the Indian Ocean, where Admiral Sir James Somerville, one of England's senior and most versatile flag officers, awaited him with the British Far Eastern Force, 5 old battleships, 3 small carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The Japanese had it pretty much their own way from 25 March to 8 April, striking Colombo and Trincomalee, sinking carrier Hermes and 2 heavy cruisers, and about 136,000 tons of merchant shipping. In 4 months' time, Nagumo had operated 1/3 of the way around the world. He had conducted strikes against ships and shore installations at Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, Ambon, Darwin, Java, and Ceylon. He had sunk 5 battleships, an aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, and 7 destroyers, had damaged several more capital ships, disposed of some 200,000 tons of fleet auxiliaries and merchant men, and hundreds of Allied aircraft. Yet not one ship of his striking force had been even damaged by enemy action. There was no longer any doubt as to what type would be the capital ship of the future. The Malay barrier was now shattered, except for isolated pockets of resistance, such as Corregidor, the colonial empires of the United States, the Netherlands and Great Britain, as far west as India and as far south as Australia, had joined that of the French, already liquidated. Within 4 months of the Pearl Harbor strike, Japan had achieved her greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. She was poised to lash backward into China, or, if America and Britain did not throw in the sponge, forward by the right flank into India and by the left flank into the Aleutians and Hawaii. Were our efforts, then, to defend the Malay barrier a waste of men and material? Admiral King is reported to have characterized the whole Southwest Pacific campaign as a magnificent display of very bad strategy. He never said what he thought good strategy would have been. Probably he meant abandoning Singapore and concentrating on defending Java, which might possibly have worked. Be that as it may, the Allies did well to fight for the Malay barrier, although fighting alone could not save it. Recent experience of the French showed the moral cost of too easy and complacent a capitulation. Another such in Southeast Asia might have been too much for the Allies to bear. So, while we mourn Houston and the other gallant ships of 3 navies that went down with most of their officers and men after fighting so bravely and well, we should not regard their efforts as vain. Their desperate exploits should forever be held in proud and affectionate remembrance by the American, British, Dutch, Australia nations, America, Britain, the Netherlands, and Australia. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was as much of a surprise to Hitler as to the United States. He had been trying to persuade Japan to attack Russia. The Chicago Tribune on 4 December printed a purloined document in which the ABC conference decision of March to beat Germany first was embodied, and the German charge at Washington promptly transmitted this to Berlin. But the revelation, instead of encouraging Hitler to continue his policy of avoiding war with the United States as long as possible, caused him to declare war on the United States, 11 December 1941. Mussolini obediently followed, and that afternoon Congress declared war on Germany and Italy.